Hello, my friend. My name is Elior, and tonight I'll be your guide through a story that quietly shapes the world around us, even when we don't notice it. Before we start, just a small favor. If these gentle lectures help you fall asleep a little easier, or if they make your nights just a bit more thoughtful, please subscribe, give a like, and tap the bell icon. Why? Because by the time this story ends, you'll probably be fast asleep. Thank you for pressing play, for choosing to slow down, and for being here. Before we begin, you can take a deep breath. Let the day settle behind you. Let the tension in your shoulders soften. You don't have to hold anything right now. Just listen. This is a gentle space for learning. Not fast, not loud. Just calm thoughts drifting through time. And tonight, we'll talk about something that touches nearly every part of life, but often hides in plain sight. Money. But not in the way we usually hear about it. This won't be a guide to getting rich or a debate about markets. This is the story of how money came to be and what it means beneath the surface. You'll hear about shells and silver, banks and blockchain. But more than that, we'll explore how money is made of trust, of belief, of quiet agreements that pass from hand to hand and mind to mind. So as you begin to drift, let's return to the beginning, to a world without coins, without price tags, but full of need, trade, and possibility. Money is one of the oldest ideas in the human mind, yet it has no scent, no voice, no life of its own. You can't eat it, you can't wear it, you can't burn it to keep warm. And still, people have crossed deserts, sailed oceans, and gone to war because of it. So what exactly is money? At first glance, it seems simple. Coins in your pocket, a number on a screen, paper with faces and stamps. But behind those things is something deeper. Money is not a thing. It is a relationship. It's a shared understanding that this item, this coin, this piece of paper, this digital entry, can stand for value, that it can move something forward, that it means something, not alone, but together. That's why money works only when people believe in it. In ancient times, there was no money. People traded what they had. A basket of grain for a clay jar, wool for firewood, meat for tools. But barter was limited. What if the other person didn't need what you offered? What if no one could agree on what something was worth? That's when humanity started to create something new. Not just a thing to use, but a symbol. Something that held value because people trusted it would hold value tomorrow. Money became a form of memory. It remembered the work someone did, and allowed it to be exchanged, even if the recipient wasn't present. It became portable trust. Over thousands of years, money took many shapes: shells, salt, metal rings, knives, stones with holes. Each culture chose something rare, portable, and hard to fake. Something that felt real, even if its value was invented. Eventually, metal coins arrived, stamped with the face of a king or the mark of a city. They told the holder, "This is worth something, because we say so, and you can use it." Later, paper money appeared, then plastic cards. Now, lines of code on a screen. The form changed, but the meaning stayed the same. Money is not just an economic tool. It's a mirror of how we trust one another, of how we build systems bigger than a village, of how we trade effort, risk, time, and dreams. This lecture will follow that story, from early barter systems to the first coins, from temples and taxes to paper and printing, from banking empires to digital currencies, from scarcity to speculation, from belief to bubbles, and back again. And through it all, we'll keep returning to one question: what gives money its power? Not gold, not ink, not algorithms, but us, humans, and our endless, fascinating ability to believe in something together. So now, with that thought, let's take the first step into the long, winding story of value and trust. To understand the idea of money, we have to imagine a time before it. No coins, no markets, no numbers, only hands, goods, and the quiet math of need. Long before there were currencies, people still exchanged. They hunted, gathered, built, wove, baked, and they traded what they had for what they lacked. This was the world of barter, a system as old as community itself. Imagine a village. One person raises goats, another grows grain, a third shapes clay into pots. Each has something useful, but not everything they need. So they trade. A basket of barley for a pair of sandals, 2 jugs of water for a blanket, fresh herbs for firewood. Simple, human, direct, and yet fragile. Because barter has a problem: coincidence of wants. It only works if both people want what the other offers at the same time in the same amount, with the same sense of fairness. But what if the potter doesn't need grain today? What if the goat herder wants shoes, but the shoemaker doesn't like goat milk? What if one person believes a jar is worth 3 fish and the other says 5? Disagreements are hard to solve when there's no common unit of value. Barter also makes saving difficult. You can't store a sack of onions for a year. You can't carry 6 chickens on a journey just to trade them later. Things rot, break, lose their worth. As societies grew, so did the need for something more stable, something rare enough to be respected, but common enough to be accepted, something easy to carry and hard to fake, something that could stand in for value without needing to be useful itself. Across the world, different cultures answered this need in different ways. In parts of Africa, people used cowrie shells, beautiful, durable, easy to count. In the Americas, cacao beans were used as currency. In the Pacific Islands, large stone discs marked wealth and tribute. In Northern Europe, it was salt, so essential to life that the word salary comes from sal, the Latin for salt. Each item was chosen not just for its material qualities, but for what it meant. Money was becoming more than a tool. It was a symbol of trust, of promise, of value remembered. And slowly, the idea of a universal stand-in for worth began to take shape. People no longer needed to want the same thing at the same time. They could trade for something else, something accepted by all, and use it later, elsewhere, with someone new. This was the first step from barter to currency, from things we use to things we agree have worth. And from this quiet shift, the story of money truly begins. Barter taught us how to exchange, but early currencies taught us something more powerful: how to agree on value even when that value could not be eaten, worn, or planted. They taught us to believe in the symbol. In many parts of the world, long before coins or bills, people used items of beauty and rarity to represent value. These weren't always practical. They weren't chosen because they were useful in daily life. They were chosen because they were special. They were hard to find, hard to fake, and instantly recognizable within a community. Among the most widespread early currencies were cowrie shells. Smooth, white, and gently curved, they were found in the Indian Ocean and traveled thousands of kilometers inland through trade. In parts of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, cowries became more than decoration. They became money. A person could carry a small bag of them and buy cloth, salt, or animals. They didn't spoil, they didn't rot, and they looked beautiful. A currency you could admire. In the Americas, some cultures used obsidian blades or turquoise beads as money. Others valued cacao beans, not just for making chocolate, but as a measure of wealth. One turkey, about 200 cacao beans, a night with a courtesan, maybe 10 beans. Across parts of ancient China, people used cowrie-shaped bronze pieces as imitation shells, a sign that the form had become more important than the substance. In Papua New Guinea, people exchanged dog teeth and feathered armbands. In North America, the Iroquois Confederacy used wampum, belts made from carefully crafted shell beads, not only as trade items, but as records of agreements and treaties. These early currencies had something in common. They were scarce, symbolic, and carried meaning beyond their function. They told stories of beauty, of status, of community, and the rarer they were, the more they were trusted. This is one of the first great lessons of money. Scarcity creates value. If something is everywhere, it becomes invisible. If something is rare, it gains power, not because of what it is, but because of what it means. But meaning alone wasn't enough. A currency also had to be recognized. That's why early money worked best in tight-knit groups. In small villages or tribal networks, everyone understood the worth of a shell or bead because they shared the same world. As trade expanded, so did the need for more universal forms of value, something more standardized, more measurable, more controlled. And that brings us to the next chapter, when money stopped being just natural objects and started to be made by hands, by states, by systems. But even as we moved into metals and minting, the lesson remained. Money is never just material. It is a language, and its power lives in the belief behind it. Shells could break, beads could fade, but something new was rising from the heat of ancient fires, heavy, lasting, bright metal. At some point in human history, people discovered that certain materials did not spoil, crack, or fade. They could be melted and reshaped. They could carry the weight of a promise without losing form. They could shine. This was the beginning of metal as money. The first metals used for exchange were bronze, silver, and gold. Each had properties that made it ideal. Bronze was strong and common enough for everyday use. Silver was brighter, lighter, and more refined. Gold, soft, rare, untarnished, seemed almost otherworldly. No matter the culture, metal brought one powerful idea: measurable trust. A piece of metal could be weighed. Its purity could be tested. It was not just beautiful, it was verifiable. And that meant it could move through hands and borders without the need for explanation. Around 5,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, people began using metal ingots as a medium of exchange. They were not shaped like coins yet, just lumps of metal traded by weight. But this introduced a revolutionary idea, that value could be stored in a precise form and carried from one place to another. In the 3rd millennium BCE, bronze became widely used across China, not just for tools and weapons, but for ritual objects that held symbolic and often economic importance. By the 2nd millennium BCE, silver was being mined and traded in the Near East. It became a standard of value in many temple economies, especially in Sumer and Babylon. Gold, meanwhile, held a different role. Its rarity made it less practical for daily trade, but perfect for tribute, storage, and royal wealth. It didn't corrode. It could be passed through generations unchanged. It held light in its color and reverence in its weight. As metallurgy advanced, so did the complexity of money. People learned to mix metals, test for purity, and standardize shape and weight. A certain lump of silver could now be measured against another and trusted to match. This reduced conflict. It built systems. It allowed for scales and contracts, for loans, taxes, dowries, and wages. Metal also allowed wealth to move. You didn't need to bring your goats to market. You could bring metal and take home grain, wine, or cloth. It was value, condensed. But still, metal had one weakness. Anyone could reshape it, melt it, clip it, fake it. So the next evolution was not about the material, but about the mark. The invention of coins would change everything. But even before coins, metal gave humans a new way to think. Not just about wealth, but about time, labor, and legacy. A stored harvest might rot, but a piece of silver could feed your family next month or next year. Metal taught us how to save, how to measure value not just in the present, but in the future. And that may be one of the most powerful inventions in the history of the human mind. Metal gave us weight, but it didn't give us identity. People could still argue, clip the corners, lie about the purity. And so, one day, someone struck a mark, a symbol, a promise, and the coin was born. Around 2,600 years ago, in a small kingdom called Lydia, something remarkable happened. A piece of metal was heated, shaped, and pressed with a royal emblem. That act, so simple, changed the history of economics forever. These were the first known coins, round, uniform, made from electrum, a natural mix of gold and silver found in the rivers of what is now Western Turkey. Stamped with lions, stars, or royal crests, they were not just metal. They were a message. They said, "This is real. This has value. And this is backed by power." Coins were different from weights or bars. They were pre-measured, guaranteed, recognizable. A merchant didn't have to weigh and test each one. The mark did that for him. The king's stamp was more than decoration. It was trust, outsourced. Very quickly, the idea spread. The Greeks minted their own coins, then the Persians, then the Romans. And by the time of the 5th century BCE, coins were common across much of the known world. Each region used different metals, copper, silver, gold, depending on local resources and trade routes. Each coin was decorated with faces, gods, animals, and symbols, not just to show value, but to tell stories. Coins became tools of identity. If you carried a Roman coin, you were part of the empire. If your market used Athenian drachmas, you lived under the owl's watchful gaze. Coins were also tools of propaganda. Kings and emperors placed their own portraits on them, often youthful, strong, divine. Even in distant lands, people would see the ruler's face every time they bought bread. Money became a kind of soft power, reaching further than armies, whispering loyalty through trade. Coins also made taxation easier. Governments could demand payments in a currency they controlled. They could issue more coins or less, depending on politics, wars, or droughts. And they could manipulate value by changing the metal content. Some coins had less silver than they claimed. Some were recalled and replaced. This led to debates, inflation, and reforms, reminding people that money, even in metal, was still a matter of belief. But even with these risks, coins became the foundation of ancient commerce. They were easy to carry, hard to counterfeit, and powerful in what they represented. Not just wealth, but connection. A coin was something you could hold that linked you to a system, a kingdom, a people. It said, "I belong to this world, and this world agrees on value." With coins, money became truly mobile, and with mobility came markets. Once coins were born, they needed a place to move, to pass from palm to palm, to carry meaning between strangers. So people gathered, and markets began to sing. Money cannot exist in silence. It needs motion, a place to exchange, to choose, to compare. That place was the marketplace. From dusty crossroads to stone forums, markets became the heart of early cities. Not just spaces of commerce, but spaces of connection. By the 6th century BCE, Greek agoras buzzed with activity. Traders from distant islands brought olive oil, wine, and honey. Local farmers sold wheat, figs, pottery. Coins clinked, scales tipped, voices rose. Each market was more than an economy. It was a map of human desire. In Rome, markets grew massive. The Forum Romanum was both civic center and trading hub. There, coins from Egypt, Gaul, and Judea changed hands. As empires expanded, so did the flow of goods and currencies. Trade routes began to stretch across deserts, mountains, and seas. The Silk Road, active by the 2nd century BCE, linked China to the Mediterranean. Along with silk and spices came silver coins stamped with Roman emperors and Chinese charms bearing celestial symbols. Merchants became more than traders. They became messengers, carrying not just fabrics and gemstones, but languages, customs, ideas, and trust. A coin minted in Athens might find its way to a market in Persia. A silver drachma could buy cinnamon in India or pay a tax in Alexandria. And wherever currency arrived, new forms of exchange and culture began. Markets also evolved socially. They were places of news, of gossip, of philosophy, politics, and entertainment. In medieval Islamic cities, the souk or bazaar was not just a market. It was an entire ecosystem. Jewelry beside books, dates beside textiles, coins beside scales, ink, and stories. Merchants learned languages, customs, conversion rates, and the subtleties of negotiation. They became cross-cultural experts, trusted to navigate both price and pride. Currency played a quiet but crucial role. Not every region used the same coin. So merchants adapted. They weighed silver by standard bars, checked purity with careful hands, and even used money changers to translate between systems. This gave rise to early forms of banking, long before the word existed. Money began to flow like a river, changing shape but never stopping. And with every exchange came more than a purchase, came connection. You weren't just buying grain, you were touching Egypt, or Carthage, or the high mountains of Persia. Markets turned the world outward. Currency became a passport, and merchants became the first global citizens. Coins had weight. They rang in the hand. They gleamed in the light. But they were heavy to carry, slow to count, easy to steal. And so, one day, someone asked, what if value could fly on something as light as a page? The first known use of paper money didn't come from Europe or the Middle East, but from ancient China. By the 7th century CE, during the Tang dynasty, Chinese merchants and officials were already using promissory notes, handwritten slips that promised value, transferable from one person to another. They were called flying cash because, unlike metal, they could be carried easily across great distances, folded, hidden, bundled. No jingling, no weighing, just words and belief. This was not yet currency in the modern sense, but it was a step toward it. By the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, China issued the first government-backed paper money. Printed with wooden blocks, these notes were beautifully decorated, stamped with official seals, and often included warnings against forgery. The notes were called jiaozi, and they circulated widely in cities and along trade routes. They were backed by deposits of metal and trusted because they came from the emperor. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, money could move without mass. A traveler could carry hundreds of units in a single sleeve. A merchant could do business without ox carts full of silver. Paper money made the economy faster, lighter, more efficient. But it also brought new risks. Unlike coins, paper could not be weighed or tested. It could be forged. Ink could be copied. Seals could be faked. So governments imposed strict controls. In some eras, forgery was punishable by death. Still, the idea spread. By the 13th century, Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, wrote of Chinese paper currency with awe and fascination. He described how the emperor's name gave power to paper, and how people accepted it as if it were gold. Europe would not adopt paper money for several more centuries, but the seed was planted, and when it finally bloomed, it would transform the world. Paper money proved one simple, profound truth. That value did not have to be held. It only had to be believed. And belief, once written down, could travel farther than silver ever had. Paper money changed how we carried value, but it still needed someone to promise its worth, to hold it, protect it, and help it move when we could not. And so, slowly and quietly, the first banks appeared, not only as safekeepers of gold and silver, but as guardians of trust. In the beginning, banks were not grand buildings with columns and vaults. They were simple benches, wooden tables in crowded markets, run by merchants, moneylenders, and temple scribes who offered one of the most valuable services in the ancient world: memory. By the 12th century, in the bustling cities of Italy, bankers were already storing wealth, lending money, and writing early forms of credit known as letters of exchange. The word bank comes from banco, the bench where moneylenders sat during business. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, These benches became the foundation of local and international economies. A merchant in Pisa could leave his coins with a banker, receive a signed note, travel across seas to Barcelona or Bruges, and present the letter to receive its value, without ever carrying metal. This simple document made money portable, and more importantly, it made trust portable. Out of this practice grew the idea of credit. A banker could say, "I know this person. I trust their word," and that trust, written down, could fund journeys, trade, or even empires. With credit came new possibilities. Farmers could plant before harvest. Carpenters could build before being paid. Sailors could launch before seeing a single coin. The world no longer needed to wait, and the future could begin today. To manage this invisible system of promises, banks kept detailed ledgers, handwritten books where every loan, every repayment, every broken or honored word was recorded. Each line told a story of risk, faith, and responsibility. By the 14th century, powerful banking families like the Medici had transformed this system into a network that stretched across kingdoms. They financed churches and kings, guided wars and peace treaties, and shaped Europe not with swords, but with signatures. Banks became more than storage houses. They were engines, quietly turning belief into action. A deposit could support 10 loans. A single borrower's name could move armies or build cathedrals. Of course, this system depended on honesty, memory, and stability. When too many promises were broken, trust collapsed, and so did entire economies. Banking brought new forms of power, but also new forms of risk. Still, it endured, because even with its dangers, the bank offered something rare and precious: the ability to remember value without holding it. It was no longer just coins that mattered, but reputation, records, and the shared agreement that some things are worth more tomorrow because we believe in them today. Banks gave money form and movement, but empires gave it purpose. When rulers began to think beyond borders, they needed more than gold and grain. They needed systems, and money became the language of control. As small kingdoms grew into empires, the simple act of trade evolved into something more complex. Markets turned into networks, and roads stretched from one horizon to another. To maintain this expanding world, rulers needed a steady source of resources, not just for glory, but for the practical things that hold a civilization together: bridges, ports, soldiers, and walls. This is where taxes came in, not as an occasional tribute, but as a structured, regular demand that tied citizens to the state. Long before banks, Even in the earliest cities, temples collected portions of harvests or livestock as offerings to the gods, and, later, as payments to rulers. But as coinage became more widespread, so did the idea of taxing in money, not just goods. This was a shift in the very nature of power. Now, wealth could be standardized. A ruler didn't need to count bags of wheat. He could demand coins, each one stamped with his image, each one a symbol of his reach and rule. In the Persian Empire, as early as the 6th century BCE, King Darius I organized a tax system that covered vast regions, from Egypt to India. Taxes were calculated in silver and gold and paid using standardized coins minted by the empire itself. This idea of a central currency, a single form of money recognized across the realm, gave rulers an extraordinary advantage. It unified economies, simplified accounting, and reminded every citizen whose face was on their coin. In the Roman Empire, tax collection was a highly organized operation. Citizens in provinces far from Rome were required to pay taxes in Roman currency, even if they lived in regions that used different coins or bartered goods. This not only reinforced the emperor's authority, but also made Roman money the dominant currency throughout the Mediterranean. Money was now doing more than facilitating trade. It was enforcing order. To pay taxes, people had to use the government's coin. To use that coin, they had to trust it. And to trust it, they had to believe in the empire that stood behind it. Governments began to use this trust to their advantage. They could mint more coins to fund wars, build roads, or pay soldiers, but they could also quietly reduce the silver or gold content, stretching their resources and sometimes triggering inflation. Still, the system worked, because money was no longer just metal. It had become a relationship. A coin was now a conversation between a citizen and a state, a shared agreement about what is owed and what is protected in return. The rise of taxation and centralized currencies turned money into a mechanism of control, but also of stability. It linked people who had never met into the same system and gave rulers tools to manage vast, diverse populations. Money, once a tool of exchange, had become a pillar of empire, and through taxes, it created something even more enduring: the foundations of governance, law, and citizenship. If empires ruled the body, then temples guided the soul. But even the divine needed walls, candles, food, and fire. And so money crossed the line between the earthly and the sacred. Long before banks, long before governments kept ledgers or printed coins, places of worship were already recording offerings, managing wealth, and holding treasure, not just in gold, but in meaning. In nearly every ancient culture, temples served as financial centers. They collected grain, livestock, oil, and silver as offerings. They stored wealth in secure chambers and often lent resources back to the community, with or without interest. These were not simply acts of charity. They were rooted in a belief that what was given to the gods would return in blessings. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temples were among the largest landowners. They managed storehouses, employed accountants, and coordinated the labor of thousands of workers. In ancient Egypt, temples played a similar role. Donations were collected regularly in the form of food, linen, and metal, and priests tracked every unit with careful inscriptions on papyrus and stone. Religion was not separate from economy. It was deeply woven into it. Money became not just a tool of trade, but a test of values. Giving was a spiritual duty, and how one gave reflected inner devotion. In Judaism, the practice of tithing, giving 1/10 of one's income, was not only a religious commandment, but a way to redistribute wealth, support the temple, and care for widows, orphans, and strangers. In early Christianity, giving to the poor was considered a sacred responsibility, not an act of pity, but of love. Saints and prophets reminded followers that money could corrupt, but also heal. In Islam, the concept of zakat, a mandatory form of charity, was written directly into religious law. It created a moral framework where wealth had to circulate, and hoarding was seen as harmful to both the soul and the community. Even in Hinduism and Buddhism, donations to monasteries and temples were understood as acts of merit, planting spiritual seeds for future blessings in this life or the next. Temples became not only centers of worship, but early institutions of social finance. They supported education, medicine, and architecture. They built bridges, both literal and spiritual. But religion also introduced caution about the dangers of wealth. Greed was seen as a kind of blindness, attachment to gold as a distraction from the eternal. Many sacred texts warned that coins could weigh heavier on the heart than on any scale. Still, money continued to pass through temples, because even the sacred requires support. A candle needs wax, a book needs ink, and a gathering of people needs space to come together. Through faith, money gained a moral dimension. It was no longer just about price, but about intention. What we gave and why we gave it began to matter as much as what we owned. In that quiet shift, currency was no longer just a market tool. It became a mirror showing not only what we could buy, but who we believed ourselves to be. Temples had held the wealth of the sacred, Empires had taxed and spent. But it was during the Renaissance that money began to transform again, this time into an idea with balance sheets, calculations, and quiet revolution. As Europe stepped into the light of the Renaissance in the 15th century, a different kind of brilliance began to emerge, not from paintings or poetry, but from paper, ink, and numbers. The cities of Florence, Venice, and Milan were not only centers of art, they were homes to some of the most sophisticated financial minds of the time. And with them came the tools of modern banking. The Medici family, based in Florence, rose not through military conquest, but through ledgers, trust, and innovation. They created branches in cities across Europe, coordinated transactions in multiple currencies, and managed accounts for popes and kings. But one of the most profound shifts came with the development of double-entry bookkeeping, a method that began to appear clearly by the 14th century and became foundational by the 15th. In this system, every transaction had two sides, a debit and a credit. One entry to show where the money came from, and another to show where it went. This was more than just accounting. It was a new way to understand money, not as a pile of coins, but as a system of relationships. Money became fluid, traceable, alive, and most importantly, accountable. Now a merchant could see not just how much gold he held, but how much he owed. A banker could track promises, debts, repayments, and risk across multiple accounts, with precision that ancient empires never imagined. This precision created confidence, and confidence created growth. Loans were no longer based only on collateral. They were based on forecasts, predictions, ledgers, and experience. Money could be lent to fund voyages, build fleets, open workshops, and start businesses that did not yet exist. Banks also began to develop new instruments. They issued promissory notes, bills of exchange, and complex arrangements that allowed capital to move faster and farther than ever before. Risk was still present, but now it was something to be measured, to be spread between investors, to be balanced with reward. This period also marked a shift in the perception of money itself. It became less physical, more abstract, more mathematical. Gold still mattered, but the real wealth was now in paper, in trust, in records, in what one could borrow, lend, insure, and calculate. By the end of the 16th century, banking had evolved into a sophisticated network capable of funding not just cities, but entire nations. Wars were financed through bonds. Cathedrals were built on loans. Exploration was underwritten by banks, not monarchs alone. From the stone tables of Babylon to the marble benches of Florence, banking had become one of humanity's most complex creations. A quiet engine beneath the surface of history, driven not by gold, but by trust. As banks grew in power and cities pulsed with commerce, money took on a new role. It was no longer just something to earn or spend. It became something to grow, a seed, an engine, a force with its own rhythm. The shift from local trade to global capitalism did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow wave, building from the harbors of Venice and Lisbon to the ports of Amsterdam and London. And with every wave, money changed. By the 16th century, European nations were expanding rapidly through exploration, seeking gold, spices, and land across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This was the age of mercantilism, a belief that national wealth came from accumulating gold and silver, and from exporting more than one imported. Empires began to treat trade not just as a market activity, but as a matter of national strategy. Monarchs sponsored voyages, navies protected shipping routes, and colonies were founded not only for territory, but for economic extraction. With this expansion came a need for organized investment. No single merchant could afford a ship to India, but a group of merchants, pooling their money, could fund the voyage and share the profits or the losses. This idea gave birth to joint stock companies, one of the foundations of capitalism. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was founded. It was among the first companies in history to issue shares to the public. Ordinary citizens could invest, buy ownership in trade, and profit from distant lands they would never see. A few years later, in 1606, the London Stock Exchange was born. Not with flashing screens and digital graphs, but with slips of paper passed between hands in coffee houses. This was a radical moment. Wealth was no longer tied only to land or labor. It could come from capital, money put to work. And capital could grow not through toil, but through time. The very concept of investment changed the relationship with money. It was no longer only earned through sweat and effort. Now it could be multiplied through strategy, risk, and waiting. This shift gave rise to an entire economic system that valued efficiency, innovation, and return. Factories began to replace guilds. Profit became a guiding principle. And success was measured not just in coins, but in margins, dividends, and growth. But capitalism also brought tension. The rewards were not equal. Investment created opportunity, but also hierarchy. Markets became tools of wealth, but also mirrors of inequality. Still, the system endured. because it unlocked something powerful. It allowed money to move beyond borders, beyond labor, beyond time. It became a force of imagination, funding ideas before they were real, and rewarding the future in the present. Trade was now part of something larger, a system built not just on exchange, but on belief that value could expand, that tomorrow could be richer than today. Where there is profit, there is also risk. And where money grows, it can also collapse. Because behind every coin, every share, every contract and promise, there is only one true currency: trust. As capitalism expanded, so did complexity. Markets moved faster, transactions multiplied, and wealth, real or imagined, began to flow through hands and systems that few could fully understand. With this came something new: financial crashes. In the 17th century, Amsterdam saw one of the first major bubbles, the famous tulip mania. Tulip bulbs, imported and grown with care, became symbols of beauty, rarity, and status. But in a short time, prices for certain bulbs rose to the value of entire houses. People began trading future contracts on flowers that hadn't even bloomed. Then, suddenly, it collapsed. Prices dropped within weeks. Debts piled up. And confidence, the quiet engine behind it all, disappeared. But tulips were only the beginning. In the 18th century, France experienced the Mississippi Bubble, a speculative storm tied to colonial trade. Not long after, England faced the South Sea Bubble. Both promised vast overseas riches. Both crashed when promises failed. These weren't just numbers falling. They were stories unraveling. They showed that modern money depends not just on gold or goods, but on shared belief. As banks and stock markets grew more powerful, a single rumor could start a panic. A delayed payment echoed like thunder. A failure in one city could ripple across continents. In the 19th and 20th centuries, crashes became part of the cycle. There were panics in 1837, 1873, and 1929, the last one igniting the Great Depression. Jobs were lost, homes disappeared, banks shut their doors, and factories fell silent. Each collapse felt like the end. And yet, each time, money survived. Why? Because trust, though fragile, can also be strong. Governments responded with new tools: central banks, regulations, insurance, and oversight. They realized that markets need more than math. They need stability. And stability means managing not just money, but emotion. When people believe, economies move. When they doubt, everything freezes. So leaders began protecting confidence as carefully as they protected currency. Over time, people understood collapse isn't the opposite of growth. It's part of the rhythm. A reminder that speculation has limits and that wealth without roots is light as air. But crashes also sparked change. They led to reform, reflection, and renewal. And through every fall, money continued. Because in the end, money is not just metal or paper. It is a mirror of human hope. Even when broken, hope finds a way to rebuild. For thousands of years, money clinked in hands, jingled in pockets, and passed person to person. But in just a few decades, it began to vanish, not in value, but in form. What was once heavy metal became as light as a tap. The shift to digital money began quietly. In the 20th century, credit cards appeared as small plastic rectangles carrying the weight of promises. Instead of handing over coins or paper, a person could now authorize a transaction, a signature, a swipe, a message sent through wires and machines. Banks followed suit. In the 1980s and 90s, electronic transfers became common. Money no longer moved in carts or bags. It moved in signals, invisible currents of trust between machines. The ATM became a symbol of this shift. A machine that gave money not because it stored it, but because it knew you were allowed to have it. Access replaced possession, and with it came a new kind of relationship with wealth. Then came the internet. By the early 2000s, online banking was widespread. Shopping, saving, sending, all could be done without touching a single bill. Apps replaced branches. Wallets became digital. And then, money reinvented itself again. In 2009, a mysterious figure named Satoshi Nakamoto introduced something entirely new: Bitcoin. It was not backed by any government, not issued by any bank. It lived in code, secured by cryptography, verified by a public network of computers with no central authority. This was the beginning of cryptocurrency, a system where trust was placed not in people or institutions, but in math. Since then, thousands of digital currencies have been created. Some have grown into vast ecosystems of value. Others have vanished overnight. But all of them asked the same question: what is money, if not belief? Meanwhile, governments and corporations began exploring central bank digital currencies, stable coins, and blockchain infrastructure. Some nations moved toward cashless economies, where street vendors and taxis accept only digital payments. A mobile phone, not a wallet, became the key to participation. But with this new freedom came new challenges. Digital money moves fast, so fast that markets can shift in seconds. It can be tracked, traced, stored, and sold as data. Every purchase tells a story, and every click leaves a fingerprint. Money in the digital age became more than value. It became information, a profile, a pattern, a mirror of behavior. Now we ask, is privacy still possible? Is freedom of transaction still guaranteed? What happens when your currency can be frozen not by vaults, but by algorithms? Yet, despite these questions, the direction is clear. The future of money will be largely invisible. It will move silently through clouds, networks, and chips. And it will be faster, lighter, and more interconnected than ever before. The digital revolution did not erase money. It rewrote it, not as gold, not as paper, but as language. One that speaks in signals, security, and speed. We've followed money across centuries, watched it change shape, purpose, and power. But money is not only about systems, it is also about people, about who has it, who doesn't, and how that changes everything. Money has always been more than a medium of exchange. It has shaped lives, defined opportunities, and drawn invisible lines between those who belong and those left outside. From the earliest marketplaces to modern cities, money is not distributed equally. Some are born into wealth, others inherit debt, and often the gap between them is not talent or effort, but access. In ancient societies, land ownership was often tied to inheritance and status. In Rome, full citizenship, and with it, financial rights, was denied to slaves and many outsiders. In medieval Europe, serfs worked land they would never own, producing value for others while holding none for themselves. And even as economies modernized, the question of who gets access to money remained deeply connected to class, race, and gender. For centuries, women were excluded from owning property, signing contracts, or holding bank accounts. In many places, this did not begin to change until the 19th century, and in some countries, even later. In the United States, systemic inequalities shaped everything from redlining in real estate to discriminatory lending in banking. Generational wealth became a reflection not only of effort, but of exclusion. Access to credit, fair wages, and financial education remain deeply uneven across the globe. Entire populations live outside the formal economy without bank accounts, identification, or stable currency. They are not only poor in income, they are poor in visibility. And then there is debt, a concept as old as money itself. What began as a tool of trust often became a burden of shame. Student loans, medical bills, high-interest credit. Modern debt can shape identity as powerfully as wealth. It can limit choices, delay dreams, quiet voices. In many ways, our world tells us who we are based on what we can afford. It praises success through material signals and punishes poverty not as misfortune, but as failure. Yet in recent years, a different story has started to emerge. Movements for financial inclusion seek to bring the unbanked into digital economies. Microfinance projects lend small amounts with big hope. Cryptocurrencies offer tools outside traditional gatekeepers, though not without risk. Social impact investing, ethical banking, and universal basic income are no longer radical ideas. They are responses to a world that recognizes inequality not just as an outcome, but as a design flaw. Because the question is not only how much money exists, but who gets to use it, shape it, and benefit from it. Our identities are influenced by what we earn, what we owe, and what we imagine is possible. And perhaps money's next transformation is not technological, but ethical. A shift from accumulation to access, from exclusion to belonging. Because when finance becomes more human, the world becomes more fair. We've followed money from shells to software, from temples to tokens. But after all the systems, banks, currencies, and screens, a quiet question remains. What can't money do? Money is powerful. It can move empires, launch ideas, shape nations, and save lives. It feeds, protects, warms, and connects. But still, it cannot do everything. There are places in the human experience that no currency can reach. You cannot buy trust. You can only earn it. No matter how much gold sits in a vault, it cannot replace the slow, honest process of building a bond. You cannot purchase time. Not really. You can hire help, speed up services, even fly across oceans. But no coin can extend a goodbye. No balance can rewind a moment. Time remains the most democratic force in existence, and the most mysterious. Money cannot truly buy love. It can create comfort, attract attention, decorate affection. But the feeling of being seen, genuinely, gently, without agenda, cannot be bought, only shared. You cannot buy wisdom. You can pay for books, courses, mentors. But the deep knowing that comes from failure, from silence, from reflection, is something no price tag can hold. And you cannot buy meaning. Many have tried. They built towers, empires, legacies carved in stone. But meaning is made not in what you leave behind, but in how you were present while you lived. In every era, we've confused price with value. But not everything precious is expensive, and not everything expensive is worth it. Dignity, for example, has no market value, but its absence is felt like hunger. A moment of kindness, a memory shared, a hand held during sorrow. These live beyond accounts and ledgers. They are what give money purpose, but they are not created by it. Even in the most advanced economies, there is a hunger not for more, but for enough. Enough to rest, enough to give, enough to belong. As we step into the future, into algorithms and virtual currencies, into digital identity and smart contracts, this reminder becomes more urgent. We are not made of markets. We are made of story, breath, presence, and care. And the most important transactions still happen in silence. We've journeyed through time, through ledgers and empires, markets and memories. Now we arrive not at an answer, but at a pause, at the quiet space between value and meaning, where money becomes a mirror. What is money after all this time? It began as shells, passed from hand to hand, chosen for their beauty and rarity. It became metal, stamped with power and promise. Then paper, backed by faith. And now it flickers as data, as numbers in clouds and screens, faster than thought. Money has built roads and walled cities. It has funded exploration and fueled war. It has freed some and imprisoned others. It has changed hands billions of times, but its essence has stayed the same: trust. To believe in money is to believe in each other, or at least in the stories we tell. We've seen how money shaped identity, who had access, who was left behind. We've watched it crash and rise, vanish into thin air, and reappear stronger than before. We followed it through temples and taxes, through stock markets and sacred texts. We explored how it binds us to systems, but also how it reflects something deeply human: our longing for security, for meaning, for a future we can hold. And yet, we've also seen what money can't do. It cannot measure love. It cannot teach kindness. It cannot offer time. Money is a tool, powerful, yes, but only as wise as the hand that holds it. And so, as we close this gentle journey, perhaps we can hold one last thought. That enough is a powerful word. That dignity, beauty, and peace may never fit in a wallet, but they can live in the spaces we create together. Let us use money not to divide, but to include, not to impress, but to uplift, not to hoard, but to share. Because what we choose to value shapes what we become. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. Thank you for listening, for wondering, for resting your thoughts in this shared space. Now close your eyes. May your dreams be light. May your rest be deep. And may the world greet you gently when you wake. Sweet dreams. And until we meet again, good night.